So a little more on the exclusion. The absence of protected water must be technically demonstrated, showing that the stimulation wells do not penetrate protected water or that they solely penetrate the exempt aquifers. Typically, these requests are for about a square mile or a map section that we approve, and the State Water Board staff then submit a letter of what we call written concurrence to the operator.
Do we actually have extensive monitoring wells for groundwater in our regions?
For the oil and gas, or?
Is that what that, you said where there is an existing regional monitoring?
Right, it would be this regional monitoring program that's defined in
Okay.
the model criteria.
Aha,
So
okay.
it'll take some time for that to be fully implemented. So it will be some time before an actual operator can not conduct groundwater monitoring based on the regional work.
And just to address the issue of cost, this program is going to take a while to become fully implemented. So in the meantime, an operator would have any number of monitoring wells as provided in some of the previous slides. But in order to reduce costs, because that's a fair amount of investment that goes into that, would those monitoring wells could they just fold into the program?
Yes, there are, as I said before, that any existing water supply wells or regional monitoring wells, if they fit the criteria, meet the criteria for the well placement for the monitoring plan, then those would be approved. So next slide, John. Thank you. So the third portion of the draft model criteria includes information on the designated contractor sampling and testing. So per SB4, operators now contact or notice property owners within 1,500 feet of a well to be stimulated. Via third party, the property owner receives a notice that they can have their water that's suitable for drinking or irrigation sampled free. Paid by the operator. So our model criteria, you can go to the next slide, includes information for the designated contractors. Information on how to become a designated contractor, to conduct the sampling, what water quality standards and testings and protocol. They will be sampling for the same suite of analyses. And that information will also be uploaded to GeoTracker. The final element of our draft groundwater monitoring model criteria is the regional groundwater monitoring program. So the three main components of the regional groundwater monitoring program include characterizing and monitoring groundwater risk zones, and I'll discuss that a little more in detail, surface activity effects, and well integrity. So characterizing the groundwater risk zones, we'll be looking at beneficial use waters located near oil and gas well production activities. There are some instances where the depth of oil production or well stimulation correlates or even overlaps with water supplies in the area, beneficial use waters. So we want to take a look at that information and identify areas that may be of higher risk. This component will also include establishing monitoring networks to provide a warning system for some of those higher risk zones. In addition, we'll be looking at surface activity effects, such as spills or the disposal sumps or ponds. Would like to characterize the legacy and currently regulated activities out of the oil fields. This will be used to characterize and look at the risks or the water quality of the shallow groundwater in those areas. Then also we'll be looking into well integrity to assess any potential risks associated with well failure. We have limited information out there right now of where the wells have failed or where there may be conduits for contamination. So this will hopefully we'll be working towards that information.
Does DTSC have more information? I know they do in LA, and so, but I don't know about Kern or some of the other areas where there's a lot of oil and gas activity. So have we mined their databases, or should we, or is it?
Remember to introduce yourself.
Kim Taylor, USGS. Yes, we should mine them. No, we have not done that yet.
Note to self.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
So, as I stated before, it's going to take a considerable amount of time before the appropriate level of data are collected and the regional groundwater monitoring is fully implemented. So, as far as the near future, the operators will have to continue to conduct area-specific groundwater monitoring. The implementation of the regional groundwater monitoring program as well as the area-specific monitoring is the first of its kind in the United States, and will be gathering information and modifying it as needed in the future. Per SB4, these model criteria will be reviewed and updated periodically. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions before? Go ahead.
Just a couple. What is your target on full implementation?
So the first step is when we come back to you on for the first board meeting in July, when we're planning on having adoption of the model criteria. At that point, that triggers the beginning of the requirements for the area-specific monitoring at that point. So the water boards will be responsible for reviewing the groundwater monitoring plans. We'll still collaborate with Dogger on those. But then at the end of next year, or this year, the beginning of next year, is when we are to begin the implementation of the regional groundwater monitoring piece of it.
But what is your target on full implementation?
As far as the regional plan goes?
Right.
I think that's a fair question. It's going to take a while to have a fully robust regional plan in place. Right now we're still working with USGS and with our other experts to have that plan laid out. I can't really say for certain how long specifically it would take, but it would take quite some time to get to a point where you would have a fully established regional plan in place. And I really don't have a specific number that I could give you with respect to that. It's a big, go ahead.
I don't have a specific number either, but the process is we're going to use existing data where possible, existing wells where possible, and then figure out where wells need to go before we actually recommend drilling those wells. And as I mentioned on April 8th, one of the time constraints is going to be well drilling, because the cost of each well is going to be between $500,000 and $1.5 million. Our current budget is $6 million a year, so that tells you how many wells we could drill without doing anything else in the program. So we're trying to be efficient and effective and light and lean as much as possible.
So the SB4 requires a periodic review, and I imagine you'll be bringing this before the board as informational items, in between any official review. So I think it'd be helpful when you come to us in July with sort of an outline on milestones for implementation of a full program, even if you don't know how long it's going to take for a full program to be established. I just think, in light of the fact that the public seems, very, and understandably so, very concerned about this, and it's a requirement for us to establish a regional monitoring program, it'd be good to let folks know, even if it's not right now that you have that information, but a sense of how long it would take before you would have a set of milestones. And also
So what it
for
would
the-
take
for the-
financially to do it too, so that we have an assessment of what we're going to need if we want to do it faster.
Right, and I suppose the operators can comment on it, but just trying to get a better sense, I would imagine that as far as their own investment, if it looks like it's going to be a really long time, then basically they're going to be doing the specific monitoring in the meantime, and they would, need to account for that in their budgets as well. The testing, I had a question about property owners that may request sampling. What is the frequency? One time only, or can they ask multiple times?
My understanding is that they are allowed to have a sample before the well stimulation and one after.
And would you be developing guidelines to assist property owners? If I only get 2 tests, I could see one before, but when would the appropriate time be for afterwards, and so that they could best utilize this opportunity?
So SB4 is written in a way where this task or this duty is split into 2 parts. First is the operator doesn't specifically notify property owners within 1,500 feet of the well that's being stimulated, or within 1,500 feet of the surface trace, or 500 feet of the surface trace if it's a laterally drilled well. So the operators work with a third party, and typically it's like a law firm, and they'll send out the notices to the property owners that are within that radius, and it's a voluntary option for those property owners to either have their well or their water sampled. And then if the property owner who receives this notice, what they're currently doing under the interim regs, and this is just basically an extension of what we're currently doing for the model criteria, is that they are given the option to contact any of the designated samplers that are on our website. They contact them, and then they come out and
Samplers
sample
would
their
make a
water. Yeah.
recommendation on this.
So any data that they collect, the designated sampler, they're required to upload those data to GeoTracker. And so far we're only aware of only one case where a property owner's taken advantage of that option. And it was a surface water sample.
I want to follow up on the DTSC information since you're sitting there. I know they have put together a model that helps to prioritize where you might look at some of the old conduits that are out there, and where there are groundwater aquifers that are most at risk. And it does seem to me that we should be connecting with them on this program. So how would I don't know who to ask, but we need to do this, because they don't necessarily have the money to do a whole lot with it, but they have got this model now that can help us, and I think it would be a nice layer to add to what we're doing here.
It just, SB4 has several pieces to it, and one of which is that the Division of Oil and Gas is required to enter into agreements, MOAs, with not only the water boards, but their air board has an MOA, DTSC, OWEHA, and maybe 1 or 2 other agencies as a result of the law, and that we have had meetings before here at Cal APA where DTSC representatives have. We have spoken about collaborative efforts, but we haven't really taken that next step, and I think you bring up an excellent point that we need to do that now.
Well, I would strongly recommend it, because I'm doing some work on groundwater in LA, and DTSC is a great partner in terms of working with the regional board as well as with the state board and others, and they have tools we don't have, and vice versa. So whatever it takes, I think we should plan on adding them in and meeting with them regularly at least here, if not in the, probably better even in the regions.
Basically, there's so much work to do that anything and everything that's already been done, we will seek out and fold in and use as much as possible. I did want to speak to your question of timing and how long it's going to take a little bit more. In our discussion paper, we did recommend a series of phases about how to collect data, how to interpret it, where to figure out where to monitor, and then how to implement monitoring such that you did the light stuff first. If you saw complexities or issues, then you would go in with more detail later. So I think we'll be working with staff to talk with them more about our thoughts about phasing, and we'll get to some benchmarks. My total guess is this is a total wag, but I'm thinking that, the priority field, we're probably going to target between 50 and 150 oil fields as kind of the first batch. And that's a lot. It's a lot of oil fields with a lot of site-specific questions and information. And things will also go much faster if we work collaboratively with the oil companies and they are able to share the information with us that they have already gathered as well.
Yeah, on this point, because I concur with Board Member D'Adamo that we need to manage the expectations of when the program is rolled out. And one thing in looking at some of the numbers that Dr. Bolin, who's conferring with Mr. Borkovich as we speak, was there were 809 well stimulations in the last year. There was 22 groundwater monitoring plans approved. So that gets you a scale potentially of going forward per year, and the area-specific monitoring that would be associated with that. So my first question is, are these type of modeling criteria, have they been somewhat applied already in the 22 groundwater monitoring plans that have been approved? And then is this, as these area-specific monitoring plans get implemented at significant expense per well, will we have an opportunity to use this infrastructure to build a regional monitoring program over time? So you take the area-specific infrastructure and then you query that as potential candidates for an eventual regional network, and then you can have some rough prediction of how much time it will take using those elements, other sources like DTSC, if it's appropriate, or other monitoring wells that are in the area, in addition to what we would otherwise drill ourselves.
So I would just point out that if there are wells that are existing, like Kim was saying earlier, we would leverage those as much as we possibly could to potentially incorporate into a regional plan. And we're open to that as an option. As far as the first part of your question, applying the model criteria during this interim period, I think that it's the interim period, it's been much more of a stripped down version of what we're proposing here. It's quite a bit more robust, but there's a lot of elements that are very similar. The number of wells, for instance, is different. Also the depths of the wells, et cetera, associated with that. And then also more specificity as far as the wells, how far the wells are to be spaced is also more specific, and an increase in the number of analytes as well.
And so there's a scale of the activity and a scale of monitoring networks that are area specific that are going to be developed associated with that. And so it gives you some idea on how much infrastructure is going to be constructed and that could feed into the regional network. So, I mean, I think it's worth looking at that and coming up with some prediction so that the public knows better than we know now what we can expect in terms of the regional network development.
I add something to the scale issue. The staff requested us to think about the regional monitoring program to look at all of the effects of oil and gas development on groundwater quality. And these model criteria for operators are being very specifically targeted towards well stimulation activities, which take place in a much, much more limited area.
I want to follow up on Board Member Moore's discussion on infrastructure, but focusing it more on sort of like our internal infrastructure. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Bogovich, that should the board adopt these model criteria in July, they will essentially become effective. Do we have the capacity now or by July to handle the influx of information and data that we are proposing to require? How will that information be collected into GeoTracker? How would it be organized and analyzed in a way where also the information would be made available to those who, of course, will be having a great deal of interest in some of this data? So internally, in terms of our internal data infrastructure, what do we need to do in order to be ready for this information? And have you considered, I'm sure you have, given how much information we're proposing to require, what would that mean to us in terms of being able to use that information, analyze the data, and draw future conclusions going forward? I think we're learning from lessons around the states in a region I won't mention with respect to the importance of data collection, data management, and also data transparency.
Well, under the interim regulations right now, operators are uploading their reports and analytical data into GeoTracker. So that's something that will continue. And as far as the information, definitely we'll be sharing that with the regional board, or with the, regional monitoring program, using data where we can, sharing wells, maybe split sampling. The actual data will be managed similar to the UST management work in GeoTracker, where each groundwater monitoring program would be a site, and it would be assigned a manager, a case manager. So that structure is already in place, and we are piggybacking or modeling ours very similar to that.
What would be the public access to that information?
Through GeoTracker, yeah.
Thank you very much for that update. And I know you said that there would be stakeholder panels, so
Right, if I could just
I'll let you be the impresario.
lay of the land here. So next we'll have the stakeholders come up and make their presentations or have their comments to us for the model criteria. The first will be our environmental justice representative from Clean Water Action, Andrew Grimberg, and he has a PowerPoint presentation. And then that'll be followed by oil and gas.
Thank you, Chair Marcus and board members. Appreciate the opportunity to present today. My name is Andrew Grinberg. I'm the Oil and Gas Program Manager at Clean Water Action. Very much appreciative of the chance to give feedback, and staff has been great throughout this whole process, as have the expert panel that's been convened, as well as the folks at USGS, who have all been putting a lot of great time and energy into this effort. So from our perspective, just to take a little step back, why are we involved in this, and what are some of the goals that we scoped out at the beginning of this process? And based on those, we can do a little analysis of where we're at now. First of all, increasing transparency was number one priority, and was really the core of SB4, and we've found that the lack of science in the debate about fracking and oil and gas in general was a little alarming, especially as it related to potential impacts on water. There was basically a myth going around that well stimulation happens thousands of feet below any protected water, therefore there's no risks, there aren't communities nearby. And we found that bringing in some scientists into this has really shed a lot of new light on it, and I think our understanding has increased dramatically. We wanted to develop, see the state develop groundwater monitoring that can measure the impacts of oil and gas activities. And, starting with fracking, which was a hot button issue for the public and somewhere we could start. And from there, we want to expand it and make sure that we really are capturing all the potential impacts. So to make these schemes as protective as possible, we need to be looking at all the potential pathways, including disposal of wastewater. We want to be protecting current, but also potential future beneficial uses. And we do want to understand the impacts on exempt aquifers, which may be an area of focus that may or may not be addressed in these specific criteria. However, it needs to be something we are thinking about for the long term. So just some quick reactions to the criteria. In general, Clean Water Action supports the proposal in front of you today, and we hope to see them finalized in something very close to what you've got right now. These appear to be science-based. We very much appreciate the process, getting stakeholder input, bringing in, the right people for the jobs to make sure this looks good. A lot of discussion is also focused on the flexibility and case-by-case situations that are going to arise. We appreciate that and want to make sure that board staff who are reviewing groundwater monitoring plans have that ability to request changes and make sure that the specifics make sense for the site. We do see these criteria under SB4 as a very good start. However, this is not the end-all and be-all of oil field groundwater monitoring. We see very good coverage of the potential impacts from well stimulation treatments. However, the whole life cycle of oil and gas production in California will need significant more attention to make sure we're catching it all. What we'd like to see is eventually move us towards a more protective plan that deal with the other impacts, such as covering all UIC wells, open pits, and also all enhanced recovery wells. So on the production side of things, it's not just fracking and acidizing that we care about, but there are fields where other activities are going on that may threaten groundwater as well, and we need to be looking at those impacts. Couple of specifics that we like, starting with the well-by-well criteria. Some of the things discussed already, such as up-gradient and down-gradient monitoring, protecting all aquifers that are present if they contain protected water, the century well concept, and also the ability of the well-by-well monitoring to fill in gaps prior to the implementation of the regional plans really makes sense from our perspective. As far as weaknesses in this proposal, we do believe that monitoring should occur in exempt aquifers, and I'll get back to that a little bit in a minute. We don't see this as fully covering all the pathways, such as open pits or UIC wells, which could be conduits for wastewater. However, once we do have a fully functional regional plans, more of those pathways will be covered, and so that's why we support those. One specific on the well-by-well protocol is we would like to see a process laid out for split samples to go to the board and whoever is implementing the regional plans. As we're working to get those up and running, the more data and verifiable independent data that those folks who are doing that can get their hands on, the better. And so that's why we'd want to start now with any sampling on the well-by-well plans, actual split samples going to USGS or the board, whoever's implementing it.
This may be, my apologies, maybe I should understand it. Where does the sample go now?
The operator would do their own testing.
Oh, and report it.
And that's good. We want them to do that, but we also want to be able to back that up and have multiple opportunities for testing on the same sample. As far as the regional monitoring plans go, we strongly support this in concept. Of course, there's a lot of work still to be done, so how those are designed will be key. Considering multiple pathways, not just the stimulation moment, is really crucial, and that's why we're happy to see the inclusion of open pits and UIC wells in the broad suite of what we're looking at in the regional plans. We do need to expand these regional plans and not just look at places where fracking is occurring. One example, put a picture there, the Kern River oil field, where there's very little, if any, well stimulation. However, there are thousands of injection wells, there's water with beneficial uses, and we need a really robust monitoring plan to deal with fields like that and all other oil fields where there's potentially beneficial use water nearby. So coming back to why we would want to monitor in exempt aquifers, if anyone is interested in more resources, Clean Water Action published a report in January on this very program. We see the criteria for exempt aquifers as not necessarily being reflective of today's current water situation in California. The criteria for exempting an aquifer was written decades ago. Most of the exempt aquifers in the state were exempted in the 80s in a very different water and political climate. We also acknowledge in the USGS white paper some of their recommendations about what to be looking at as far as what levels of TDS, cutting off at 10,000 TDS or relying on exemptions that not necessarily have been thoroughly vetted by state water experts. Saying that there should not be monitoring in those cases doesn't necessarily make sense, since the Water Board wasn't involved in any of the past exemptions, and we support the efforts to be involved right now in all the ongoing activities in this realm. But we want to understand what the quality in these aquifers is. If there's a chance to save them, we might want to use this water at some point. And so saying we don't have to monitoring there right now, we believe is not the right idea. Quick note on underground injection. It's obviously been in the news and a very high-profile issue recently. This is a map of some of the wells that have been classified as exempting into potential underground sources of drinking water, and it's a combination of disposal wells and injection wells used for enhanced oil recovery. We know that injection has occurred into drinking water aquifers. What we don't know is what the extent of those impacts may be. Currently, the assessment going on is really from a water well centric perspective, which is, we understand that's a good place to start, but there hasn't been the monitoring scheme needed to really assess an aquifer and what the impacts of these activities have been. We see this as something that should be considered as we're developing the regional plans and really trying to understand what the impacts on groundwater has been of, whether it's improperly permitted wells or, all other oil fields. The current compliance plan, we feel, needs a little more on this actual monitoring piece in order to really understand what the long-term impacts of these improperly permitted injection wells has been. Oops. As far as open pits go, we're really happy to see that they're flagged as needing monitoring in the regional plans. What we would like to see is a prohibition on this disposal method, and I've gotten up here and said it before, and I'll continue to say it. The point of a monitoring plan is to identify problems. I believe that we've found one, and it's time for a prohibition. We believe that that's appropriate on a statewide level. As far as where do we go from here in filling the gaps, certainly implementing the SB4 monitoring program fully and funding it fully is top priority. We fully support that. There are some proposals to expand this. I would just call your attention to AB 356, a bill that Clean Water Action is sponsoring. It would require UIC monitoring and really fill in the gaps so we can get to the point where our oil fields throughout the state are being monitored appropriately. We believe that it will get us to a place where we understand the impacts of oil and gas development on groundwater, and that's one of our goals. Assessing exempt aquifers, looking for places where we want to change the status of that. What is the current water quality and the future potential uses in those exempt aquifers is something the state and really nowhere in the country has anyone really tried to figure out, and I think that the time is now to move forward on that. assessing aquifers that may be impacted by illegal injection, including shutting down any injection wells which has the potential to impact water quality. And that's another issue that there's been a lot of public debate about, and we've weighed in on in numerous avenues, and we'd like to see more aggressive action by the board and other regulatory agencies. And finally, prohibit open pits as a clear, low-hanging policy to protect water quality. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions?
Well, I could use a little clarification perhaps from Michael Loffer. So the scope of SB4, does it exclude regulation and ascribing monitoring requirements related to underground injection control?
That's correct. It was limited to the well stimulation technologies, and so it typically falls into the broader bucket that Dogger already had or the residual authorities that the Water Board already had.
Clearly, there's a logic to the presentation that if you're going to do regional monitoring to take into account potential sources, but to date, in the evolution of this program, that would be an add-on at this point.
Well, I believe in the law, it doesn't prohibit the board from doing monitoring where UIC wells are present or other types of activity. What it says is that you need to do well-by-well monitoring where stimulation occurs, and that you also need to do regional plans in any place where well stimulation might occur. Does not prohibit doing that in other places as well.
And that's correct. That was the reference to the board's residual authority. There's nothing that prohibits or constrains it.
I know you'll stay around.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for all the time you've put in. Next. Kevin? Mr. Buchan?
Next up will be a presentation by Oil and Gas.
Morning.
Good morning, board members. This is Kevin Buchan with the Western States Petroleum Association. I am managing the project for our members on the SB4 implementation by your staff. I'm joined today with Peter Zawaslansky from Terraphase Engineering. WISPA retained their expertise in helping us develop our input to your staff's regulations and comment letters, and they were part of pulling together this presentation. If I get questions that are pretty complicated, I'll probably defer those to Peter. He's our resident expert. Other than that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And I think what I'll do is I'll let your assistant staff move the slides, or is this thing working? Oops, did I do that? The right arrow. Oh, okay. All right, so we just wanted to cover some introduction. We've been working with your staff. We actually met with them on the draft regulations. We really appreciate their efforts, especially considering the time frame that we're underneath. It's a pretty difficult schedule for us to be able to meet. In general, these regulations are going to comprise the most extensive, stringent regulations for groundwater monitoring associated with hydraulic fracturing. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but that's how we see them. This is a wholly new uncharted area, and this is one of the reasons why we are so actively engaged in this effort, and we appreciate being able to work with staff on this. We mentioned earlier that we've hired Terraphase Engineering to help us out on that. And today, what we're trying to offer in the spirit of helping out with this program is our perspective on what we think works, what we think doesn't work, and kind of what we would do to make this program work. So we're going to cover 5 issues here, talking about the monitoring criteria should be commensurate with the amount of risk. And we'll get into kind of what that means. We think it should be based on sound science. We always typically take that position, and we'll get into that a little bit more detail. We also want to talk a little bit about the analyte list. Your staff showed you a fairly comprehensive list that We have over 70, almost 80 analytes that we're going to be asked to be monitoring for if this goes forward. One of the issues is we think, and we'll get into more of this in the actual, the draft regulations, is if there's a hydrocarbon-bearing zone, we think that should be clearly exempt. And we're going to get into a little bit about why we're making this distinction as opposed to what's in the draft regulations. And then one of the things that we would like, which is for us is kind of more of in terms of plan approval certainty, is is it possible for us to have a process and a schedule, so that our members have some predictability when they submit plans as to, in terms of review and approval and things like that. So let's talk about commensurate risk. One of the things that it was mentioned earlier by, I think by staff or one of the other commenters about having, when you have a spill and you have this long-term program, a stimulation event for hydraulic fracturing lasts anywhere from about 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then it's done. And then once it's done, that well becomes essentially like a regular production well that they have all those out there. We also think that if you're looking at the difference in groundwater and depth and the quality as a resource, we think that's kind of important. Your staff have proposed that anything below 10,000 micrograms per liter total dissolved solids, or TDS, should be protected. We're not opposing that, but for us, as we get into later in the conversation here about one well monitoring well upstream and 2 monitoring wells downstream for every penetration is extensive. And we'll get into kind of more why we think that's the case.
But they didn't say every penetration. They said it could be in groups.
Correct, and we're gonna touch on that a little bit later. But when you start to, one of the issues that we've been wrestling with is the idea that you have an upstream up gradient well, when your down gradient well, if you take a sample prior to hydraulic fracturing, is going to capture what's currently there prior to hydraulic fracturing. So having an up gradient well, we don't really see as having really any purpose. We also talk a little bit about potential vertical pathways based on proximity. There's this whole concept of axial dimensional stimulation area, and it's the area around the actual fracturing, fractured rock. And we also talked with staff about this idea that you have these, different zones and areas and faults and things like this that will essentially isolate with a fracturing event from any groundwater, and those seem to be absent from the criteria completely. The other issue is if you have protected groundwater and you're fracturing thousands and thousands of feet below that, the likelihood of the WST fluid that is only being pressurized for 30 minutes to 2 hours of reaching that protected aquifer based on the professional experience of our geologists and other hydrogeologists we've talked to, is highly unlikely. And then we talk a little bit about proximity to human population and public service wells, which is required in SB 4. So we think it should be adapted based on sound science. So what is it we really mean about this? Well, one size doesn't really fit all. In California, we have a tremendously complex underground hydrogeology. And to say that we can just kind of fit one program and have 1 up gradient, 2 down gradient monitoring wells for every situation is not really practical, in a sense that there's a lot of difference going on out there. There may be well stimulations that require more information or more wells, but then also the opposite is true. And we would like to be able to have that flexibility when our members submit plans according to your regulations that reflect that. If we can demonstrate that we can do this better, give you the same information to protect protected water, then we should be able to do that. So I covered everything else on that slide. One of the things that we've been emphasizing, and we sat down and talked with your staff, is it really should focus on 2 key components: real-time monitoring to ensure casing integrity. So what do we mean by this is, right now, when our members conduct hydraulic fracturing, they do pressure monitoring on the actual well itself where they're doing fracturing. And if there's any pressure difference in that, that well gets shut down immediately. Essentially what they are doing is monitoring directly in the well itself. And once the fracturing is done and the pressure is removed, kind of like, basic physics is fluids and oil will flow up the path of least resistance, which is up the wellbore. Now, we're not saying we don't want to do monitoring, but we're actually right now doing monitoring in the interim regulations, and they've done this consistently historically to where they know what's going to happen. If there's any kind of leak through the well casing, they will be able to detect that immediately. And one of the things in your staff has in their regulations is that they want, near-term, short-term monitoring so that they can know if there's a WST fluid component that's moving out of the area and towards protected water. Well, we're doing that right now.
Before you move off this point, though, and I apologize, I'm going to take a little bit of time here because I think this is an important point. The real-time monitoring that is currently being conducted right now is it real-time monitoring of groundwater at the site of the operation. Because the reason I asked this question, Mr. Buchanan, is at least I've been advised by staff that the focus of SB4, the directive in SB4 charged to the board, is of groundwater monitoring, area specific as well as project specific as well as a long-term regional monitoring of groundwater. So while the real-time monitoring that you're discussing is obviously very important and has very valuable information upon which to share, it's not the groundwater monitoring that is required to be developed by the board specific to SB4.
So to answer your question, our thought on that is we're not opposed to monitoring for the groundwater. However, right now we are monitoring those fluids, and if they end up leaving the well or leaving the area of the fracturing, we are going to know that immediately. And then they have to implement remediation activities and shut down that well, and if there's a need for them to then install monitoring wells nearby to determine what the extent of that migration is, then they would be required to do that. That's an existing practice. I understand what you're saying is you're required to monitor groundwater, and we know that that's going to be a part of this regulation. What is missing in this regulation is the recognition that we are actually monitoring in place right now, so if there's any migration of that WST fluid, we will know that immediately, and therefore you can. That should be part. I think that should be recognized in your regulations, and it is not.
Recognize in what way? And without, I'm not meaning to put words in your mouth, but my interpretation of your recommendation is if your real-time monitoring shows that there is not a potential problem associated with the activity, then there would not be groundwater monitoring associated with that.
That second part is not true, and when we get into later slides, we'll show you what we're proposing in terms of the area-wide monitoring, because the oil companies don't just go out and pick a well and stick it out in the middle of nowhere by itself. They typically set up a monitoring network where they're going to have multiple different wells. I mean, they're in the business of finding oil, so a single well is probably not likely in what they do. But in our later slides, we'll show you how we would address that. In terms of the area-wide monitoring, we're going to show you some slides and it's kind of what we think that looks like. Unfortunately, we think the area-wide monitoring plan that staff have proposed in their regulations really ends up being, from a practical standpoint in implementation, a well-by-well monitoring program. So we talked a little earlier about analytes, and we looked at the number of analytes, and there's analytes on there that aren't even in WST fluids. And that was kind of a surprise for us because we thought what we were really trying to do is monitor groundwater in the event that any of the WST fluids migrate out of the fracking zone and into protected water. So that was kind of a surprise for us. What we thought would be better and what we would propose to staff is that they narrow this list down to things that are really going to detect whether you have movement of a WST fluid into groundwater.
One of the, sorry to interrupt you. it's
No, go
just
right ahead.
striking me, one of the different streams of approach compared to, say, Mr. Grimberg is he wants us to look more broad than just well stimulation. And what you're saying is we should focus this just on well stimulation. I just want to make sure I understand where the different.
So our understanding is that you're trying to implement SB4 for well stimulation. We know that there is a review that UIC program that Mr. Greenberg was mentioning earlier, and that's ongoing right now. That's a program where your staff are directly involved with Dogger and DOC to do that. What we chose to focus on today is what is it that you guys are required to do in SB4, and how can we give our input on how you would best accomplish that?